Okay, hi. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Finding Common Ground discussion. My name is Marlo. I am secretary to the board of directors for for the U.S. And so this will be a discussion about drug policy of the future and a constructive conversation about the decriminalization and legalization of drugs. And will be your moderator. For this discussion, we will have three speakers: Jules Hodge, Kat Ebert, and Nic Lewis. This debate will be divided into three sections. In the first section, I will be asking 4 questions total. The speakers will have 2 minutes to answer the question. The rest of the speaker will have 1 minute each to reply to the first speaker's answer, and who will also have 1 minute for their rejoinder, the reply to the reply. The first section shouldn't take more than 25 minutes. The second section will be dedicated to an open discussion about any topic that was misunderstood in the first section, or to bring all that was talked about into the finding common ground approach. And for our final section, we will have an open table for the members of the audience, you beautiful people, to ask questions. And first off, we'll start off with introductions. I already introduced myself, and our other moderator and amazing host and amazing organizer for this whole thing, and for like just everything with the debate. It's like all props to you, dude. Julia da Silva, take it away.
Hello guys, so like Marlo said, this debate will have 3 sections. We have amazing people speaking on amazing topics I hope everyone like, and we can start.
So for our first introduction of the speakers, we will have Jules Hodge, Kat Ebert, and Nic Lewis following. And with the introductions, just tell us what you're standing for and about yourself.
So, hi, I'm Jules Hodge. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm one of the co-presidents at the University of California, Santa Cruz chapter. Most notably, I was one of the people who really pushed through the Decriminalized Santa Cruz Resolution that last January decriminalized entheogenic plants and fungi in the city of Santa Cruz. So I'm talking about incremental decriminalization. So that refers to when we just decriminalize one or a few substances at a time. We saw it first with cannabis. We're seeing it again with psilocybin mushrooms and other entheogenic plants and fungi. I personally am arguing this as more of a temporary fix on our way to full decriminalization. I do see places like Oregon, what they passed, as more ideal, but I find this more useful in places where there would be little to no traction with full decriminalization because of the stigma attached with some illicit drugs.
Hi everyone, my name is Kat Ebert. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am officially an MSU alumni as of this morning. And so I will be speaking for, and I'm also on the board of directors for SSDP. I will be speaking for the Decrim All Drugs Resolution, or stance. There we go. And so I'm supporting Decrim All because we want to end the most amount of harm the war on drugs causes to the disproportionately impacted communities of color, communities of lower socioeconomic class. We want to end those harms the most effectively, the most immediately. And we're not going to do that without decriminalizing the possession and use of all controlled substances in addition to drug paraphernalia. So that is my stance that I will be speaking on today.
Hi, I'm Nic Lewis. I am, now that Kat has graduated, the president of the Michigan State University chapter of SSDP. Within both of the models you just heard, they discussed decriminalization. I personally believe that these models have shortcomings that don't address a variety of problems in regards to protecting workers, consumers, and the environment from exploitation. The model I propose is a legalization model that actively attempts to counteract the exploitative nature of capitalism within the United States by the inclusion of a socialized market of manufacturing and distribution. This is necessary for the inelastic market that psychoactive substances create, which is to say a market in which the demand remains stagnant regardless of the supply or quality. And a socialized market would allow the profit incentive to be shifted from the consumer or the worker and instead from the government, which also would help to prevent the development of monopolies and by allowing an opening for vast regulation to protect the environment and sustainability of both botanical and non-botanical substances we all love.
All right, awesome. Okay, so for our first question in section 1, we will have, taking into consideration that we live in a capitalistic society, how will your model affect / protect the workers, farmers, people that work in the production, in the industry? We'll start off with Jules, a reply from Kat, a rejoinder from Jules, a reply from Nic, and finally a rejoinder from Jules. And whenever you're ready.
All right. So, so most obviously, growers and producers won't be at as much of a risk for being incarcerated. And even though some of these drugs that are being decriminalized first don't have high crime rates associated with them, there are still a few people who are helped in the meantime. And I believe when these incremental decriminalization campaigns are done right, they can start to open people's minds about other substances. Also, workers under decriminalization are less likely to lose their job to larger companies than it does under legalization. For example, here in Santa Cruz back in 2006, the voters passed Measure K, which decriminalized cannabis in the county. And it was repealed in 2018 after Proposition 64 was passed. The thing is, after Measure K was repealed, you start seeing arrest rates rising again because of people selling cannabis without a license. So, that's my bit.
So when we're talking about decriminalizing all drugs, it's a little more difficult to protect the workers when things are still decriminalized, or when they're decriminalized, but they're still illegal. But with this model, with the model that we're actually working on in my city of the East Lansing right now, we are including the Grow Gather Gift model that's included in Decrim Nature's model. So this protects the people that are growing these plant medicines and distributing them as well. And while that doesn't necessarily carry over for controlled substances as well, again, going back to what I said earlier, we're stopping incarcerating people. Because how can people have access to these plant medicines if they're still incarcerated? So people that have generational trauma and just regular trauma, people that go to prison for having a substance use disorder, how are they going to have access to these healing medicines? So when we're talking about protecting the workers in a capitalistic society, Decrim doesn't offer the most protections for these workers. However, we are ending.
Thank you. That was your minute.
Yeah, that's a great point and something I'm definitely gonna consider. Thank you for bringing that up. I have nothing else to reply to that.
While I do believe that individual retailers of these substances have the opportunity to be protected under this model, I do worry about lack of regulation in a business that may come to fruition under it. So how can the legislation involved in the decriminalization of these substances protect farmers who work under others? Is there a way to guarantee that these workers be paid equitably for their labor if they themselves aren't also the ones distributing it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Chill out. Sorry, my dog's being crazy. So sorry, my dog distracted me. That is a great point, and I have nothing else to add.
Right, excellent. For our following question, how will your model make sure that people with marginalized identities and minority communities won't be unjustly persecuted? We'll start off with Kat, a reply from Nic, a rejoinder from Kat, a reply from Jules, and a rejoinder from Kat.
So when we're talking about reinvesting in the communities that have been the most disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, I like to reference Detroit, the city of Detroit. So they recently passed an ordinance that allows 75 retail recreational cannabis dispensaries in the city of Detroit. Of those 75, 1/3 of them, only 1/3 can be non-residents of Detroit. So by passing this ordinance, residents of the city can now open dispensaries, and that money comes back directly to the community members. So when we're doing a Decrim All resolution, and we want to talk about protecting the communities that are most disproportionately impacted, communities of color have a low use of plant medicines a lot of the times compared to white communities. And even though that they're amazing plant medicines and they're amazing healing tools, so I'm losing it. So when we want to protect these communities, we need to stop incarcerating them. I'm always going to come back to mass incarceration. That's the biggest problem we have right now, because how can someone that provides their family continue to do that when they're in prison for illicit drug use? So by passing ordinances like these, when we do have cannabis is obviously different because it's legal, but keeping that in mind, because when we make things commercialized and when we legalize things, then more times than not, if we look at the cannabis industry, white people are profiting while black and brown people are still sitting in jail, suffering. I rest my case.
I do believe that Decrim All addresses and protects marginalized communities from legal persecution for drug use, but I don't believe it prevents economic persecution. I fear for the creation of something called monogopolies under the system. Monogopolies are like localized monopolies. When discussing an inelastic good, for example, gas, in my hometown, there's one gas station. So the gas station can set the price and have no local competitors to bring the cost down, as would be implied in the capitalist understanding of the economy, while everyone, at the end of the day, still needs gas. So what prevents the exploitation of consumers in a marginalized community from the creation or existence of these monopolies? And how can Decrim legislation be formatted to address this concern? Which is to say, how can you ensure equal access to these substances so no one can abuse this system that is created and economically exploit those in communities that may have little access to these substances in the first place?
Excellent point, Nick. And agreed that things need to be regulated in a non-capitalist society. But when we are ensuring equal access, so access and education are the two most important things of any kind of Decrim resolution. You need to educate the community and the public and let them know like what you're actually doing. And so when we're talking about providing access to the communities that have been the most disproportionately impacted, you do need to, I'm losing my train of thought. So when we're talking about this, again, making sure that the grow, gather, gift model is protected so communities can grow these plants and these medicines and continue to pass them out, while people that use highly stigmatized drugs, have substance use disorders, are also still not going to prison, going to jail, being arrested, having the economic, financial aspect of going to jail and going to prison that weighs on them as well.
All right, so here we go. Yeah, so I know with measures like with Decrim Santa Cruz, we aren't as comprehensive, but we still live in a town where we couldn't pass a lot of this extra stuff that I really wish we could pass because there's still a lot of stigma. There's a lawsuit right now going against the syringe exchange site here, and we just couldn't gain traction with a lot of these progressive policies you're talking about. And it sucks, but I believe that when we do it right, it can contribute to people starting to associate the stigma with this kind of stuff when we couple it with a comprehensive educational campaign.
Yeah, great point, Jules. And again, I agree that incrementalism is the most realistic approach in a lot of areas because of the stigma that surrounds highly stigmatized substances. So that is the most realistic approach in some areas. I'm a big dreamer. I believe anything is possible. So, and I'm also a huge education nerd. So I believe that if people are educated, if they understand issues through the lens of drug policy that we all know, I believe that the public will change. The view on these stigmatized substances will change. We need to start focusing on addiction and drug use as a public health issue and not a public safety issue. Communities of color should not be over-policed like they are right now, and then that leads to higher arrest rates. So, yes.
Excellent. And for our final question of this first section, and my favorite question, because as you learn to know me, you will realize I love drugs and nature. So, final question, how does your model affect sustainability? First, we'll have Nic, a response from Jules, a rejoinder from Nic, a reply from Kat, and a rejoinder from Nic. So, take it away.
We all live on the same planet, and climate change is a large concern that faces young folks all over the globe. This is also a conversation that is constantly prevalent among drug policy activists due to hazards implied with production. The manufacturing of currently illicit substances is inexplicably tied to the creation of waste products and used solvents that have to be disposed of. Think of MDMA synthesis byproducts that are being dumped into public waterways in the Netherlands, a current issue. This is a concern that exists within our current criminalized system and would be maintained in a decrim some model. In the decrim all model, there would have to be access to proper methods of disposing of these byproducts if manufacturing were to be decriminalized. But in a legalized model, regulation and waste disposal access will be inherently considered as with chemistry industries. Furthermore, when discussing biotically sourced substances like mescaline from peyote or 5-methoxy-DMT from the Bufalvarius toad, concerns exist under decrim all for the protection of local life and the prevention of poaching. And concerns exist even under decrim nature. Even with the criminalization of the ability to grow, for example, peyote, this doesn't mean that growing is easy or quick, especially compared to poaching. All of which doesn't even touch on the international unsustainable harvesting of natural precursors for synthetic substances, like the widespread deforestation that's happening in Cambodia to harvest saffron oil for MDMA production, which isn't necessary for said production, but is easier and more cost efficient. So I ask of Kat, how do you contend with clandestine byproducts and their disposal? And I ask of Jules, how do you contend with protecting psychoactive plants in the wild when there's a barrier of difficulty that exists when trying to grow these substances themselves individually over the ease of poaching?
Yeah, I think I go first. So to be honest, this is an area where legalization does make a bit more sense. And when considering decriminalization, we rely on the goodness of cultivators and producers to make sure that they're working in a sustainable way. And part of what we should be doing as activists is educating others on how they can contribute to the well-being of our planet while they produce their goods or get their goods.
And I think that's valid, and I think it's a discussion that needs to constantly be had. But I guess my concern is something that can only really be addressed in a regulated, legalized market is holding people accountable and making sure that environmental sustainability is constantly on our minds as we talk about this.
So it's interesting that you bring up byproducts because there's actually tons of pharmaceuticals in our water and in our ground and everything. Only 30% of that actually comes from big pharma and pharmaceutical waste. So the other 70% actually comes from human waste, home waste, not knowing how to properly dispose of medications. So the decrim model really there's no regulation of products. There's no regulation of creating the products. However, when we look at, there are regulated systems already, illegal, illicit regulated systems like the dark web, where the consumers trust the producers, and the producers are making substances that they want their consumers to enjoy. So there is already a market that we know what this looks like. But, until we legalize drugs in a non-capitalist society, which I think we're all in agreement is the best, most ideal option, that is something that the decrim all model can't necessarily ensure that there's sustainability when creating these products or that these products are regulated when consumers are using them.
And I also want to be clear, too, that when talking about pharmaceutical medication in the public waterways and such, that is within an industry that is inherently regulated. It's a legalized industry. And so currently the illicit clandestine chemistry byproducts are a big issue. And that's what I mentioned briefly when talking about waterways in Netherlands for MDMA production. It's still a criminalized market. It's an issue. But yeah, yet again, legalized system is the only way to really format and ensure regulation in all points and all points of concern.
You all did amazing. And so that concludes the first section of the questions and replies. For section 2, we'll have an open floor for the speakers to ask questions to each other on topics that weren't covered or were poorly answered. And you can use the space to format what finding common ground is, and what sort of ideal policy can come out of the intersection of Decrim some, Decrim all, and legalize all.
If I may first. I would like to ask Jules and Kat if either would like to respond. You both talk about incrementalism on a local or state level as the main reasoning for why your system is important. But I want to ask on a federal level, do you believe that the same incrementalism is important? I personally believe that the legalization of all substances, even with a socialized framework, may be more well received by dogmatic conservatives by virtue of efficient messaging. Think of Switzerland's legalization and by extent nationalization of production and sale of heroin. Mind you, Switzerland's a country where the Overton window is further right than in America. While I don't like or support the Switzerland system, and it's not a perfect example of decriminalization or legalization of all, it's actually a legalization of a specific substance. It is a specific substance that is highly stigmatized. And I think it serves as a good example of the kind of messaging that can be used for legalization, even with the most stigmatized substances, over decriminalization, which that messaging is kind of inaccessible.
Yeah, so I think the incrementalist approach is important for making sure that the drug policy that's passed is actually the most sensible drug policy. Because if we try to just rush and do this on a national level and freak a lot of people out because there is still so much stigma and there is still so much lack of education, if we just try to rush and do everything all at once, that opens up a lot of that leaves a lot of space for bad drug policy, non-sensible drug policy to actually take effect. And then it's a lot more difficult to come in after the fact and try to change these things. So the incrementalist approach, the grassroots approach, getting these from the ground up, finding out in particular cities, what's the most effective for that city. East Lansing doesn't have a huge houseless issue or a huge highly stigmatized drug issue. Our neighboring city, state capital, Lansing, does have a very serious, highly stigmatized drug use rate and houseless problem. And so this decrim all it will help people in East Lansing, but we're hoping that, by pushing this through in the neighboring city, then maybe we can take on Lansing next, which is a little more conservative, a little more difficult. But this incrementalist approach, when we want to make sure that we're passing absolutely sensible drug policy, it does make sense in a lot of areas to really tackle one part at a time to make sure that it is the most sensible and it is the most effective and it's not going to cause more work for people later.
I totally recognize the validity in everything you're saying. I think that's very fair. I will just say, it's something to be mindful of, though, on a national level, when we've already gone through all of these issues like sustainability of the environment that are kind of inherent to some of the other systems as opposed to legalization. Even, I think all that is to say that if we do push for legalization on a federal level, it would have to be very mindfully gone through and formatted for all of the issues that we've addressed. But I also think that if we do decriminalization first and we take a long time to get to a legalized system on a federal level, there might be a lot of impact, negative impact that we hadn't considered, like sustainability of the environment.
Yeah, and I guess, yeah, to tie this in to finding common ground. So we all have these points, we're all passionate about these different stances that we have, but as I'm sure most or all of you have seen throughout this debate, multiple times we've all commended each other on the great points that we've made, because that is what this session is about. We are finding common ground, and we're finding across the country in the US that there are a lot of groups with Decrim Nature or SSDP, Drug Policy Alliance, that are trying to pass these decrim policies at a state or citywide level. And there's some pushback, there's some tension, and it's from a lack of alignment with messaging. But when it comes down to it, like, we're all trying to fight the same wars. We're all fighting the war on land-based people, and the war on consciousness, and the war on melanin, and the war on human rights, and the war on drugs. We're all fighting these wars. They're all in our collective vision. So that's what this panel, that's what this session is about, to really dive into these, give SSDPers and young people talking points for when talking about these policies, but to also remind everyone that we're all fighting the same fight, and we're all doing it together. And some things make sense somewhere, and other things make more sense in other places. So yeah, that's why we're hosting this session. We all love each other, and we all have really great points. And yes, and yeah, all finding common ground.
Also, to add, I don't want to like hijack too much time, but I also think it's important to recognize, like, in the context of what we're doing, that we are also trying to like acknowledge and shine light on some of where different systems have shortcomings, and to create an environment and a space for people to kind of creatively think up ways to address the issues that we've acknowledged within the less progressive systems, right? In a decrim sum model, in a decrim all model, how do you address stuff like environmental sustainability? And how do you address all of these more specific, like, economic concerns and ease of access in these smaller models that don't include stuff like a regulated economic market, you know? And I think that, you know, in talking about this and opening the floor to everyone in SSDP, the 192 people here, can really help us as we move forward as drug policy activists.
Cool. So, Jules, did you have anything you wanted to say before we move on to audience questions?
No, you covered everything I wanted to say. Yeah, you guys are great.
All right, awesome. Thank you guys. Just lovely answers, lovely perspectives. And we do some, my English, what? My bad. We have some audience questions right here. We have 4 actually. And I don't know if our host would like to take them away.
Yeah, thank you. So our first question is from Hunter. For legalization team, how might we see research chemicals responsibly and sensibly legalized? What regulation might prevent harm for newly discovered or produced novel psychoactives introduced in the future?
That's an excellent question. And this is something that we're often thinking about, to consider the reasoning for a lot of people using NPSs, novel psychoactive substances. While there is a subgroup of people that are using these substances because they want to try like the newest substances out and like are the true antithesis or the pure form of the term psychonaut, I also recognize, and it has to be recognized in drug policy, that a lot of people are forced to use substances that they wouldn't go to initially by virtue of lack of access. Think of recently MXE was banned, production was banned in China a few years ago, and access to MXE or methoxetamine has diminished greatly. And so now you see a lot of the new oral cyclohexylamines that are coming out, like DMXE, MXIPR, MXPR, and all of these other substances that may not have been a drug of choice that people would have wanted to go for, but then they did because they want MXE. And so in a legalized in a market in which all substances are legalized, I would also want people to be mindful that how often would people actually want to go for these newer substances? And I think that there has to be, of course, regulation in terms of harm reduction and doing testing to make sure these substances are safe. But at the end of the day, people are doing them now. And in a legalized market, I feel like people should have the right to be able to use these substances, albeit with being mindful of safety risks and what might be some of the risks that are incurred for these substances.
So the next question here is from Logan. A lot of the panel's discussion has focused on plant medicine's incrementalist position. When stigma is a main concern or reason to not push for decrim all, what do you propose to make sure stigmatized substances don't get left behind? For decrim all, in a society with rampant issues in the behavior of law enforcement officers and differential enforcement of laws, how do we make sure some substances are not policed more aggressively than others? So I think this is a two-part question. So let's go with the first one. Like when stigma is a main concern, what do you do to make sure stigmatized substances don't get left behind?
Excellent question, and I'm so glad that you brought this up because this is kind of this is something that we're really focusing on with our Decrim Resolution here in East Lansing. So something that Somerville, Massachusetts actually did, their Decrim Nature group partnered with DPA, and they passed a Decrim Nature Resolution with a specific resolve that decriminalized the possession and use of all controlled substances. So what they did in an area where there's a lot of stigma surrounding highly stigmatized drugs, but there is a lot of highly stigmatized drug use as well, what they did is they basically just used a decrim nature front with plant medicines. It's less, a lot of people are more likely to, support those because they are not as stigmatized. So using that kind of front, that decrim nature front, and then throwing in a resolve that effectively decriminalizes the use and possession of all controlled substances, while it's not ideal, that is a way that in an area where stigma is very high, you can make sure that other highly non-plant medicines are also being protected with the Decrim Resolution and legislation.
Okay,
Yeah,
so for
go
ahead. I was gonna move to the second part of the question, but keep going. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, we didn't do quite that with Decrim Santa Cruz, but we still did have a lot of discussion around stuff when we planned our presentations for city council or wrote letters for people to endorse, things like that. A few people in our group did accidentally go to the stigmatizing of other substances, which, we always sit down and we talk through things, talk about how we can change this and what we're doing, how we can phrase it to make sure we don't stigmatize this stuff. And there were a few people in decriminalized Santa Cruz who did have reservations about other substances, and we start to open minds, and we really did see that start to change a little bit, and I was happy about that.
Yeah, and the risk of societal stigma influencing local elected officials, minds and decisions is always going to be a risk. So again, going back to what Jules was saying and what I've said before, the educational campaign is the most important, because what we're really trying to do is a cultural revolution. And so to do that, you have to run an educational campaign. You don't want people agreeing with you because they agree with you because you told them to. You want them to understand what you're talking about and have them come to that agreement on their own. That's how we start a cultural revolution, and that's how we end the stigma surrounding substance use on a much larger scale.
Okay, so I'll move to the second part of the question, which was in a society with rampant issues in the behavior of law enforcement and differential enforcement of laws, how do you make sure some substances are not policed more aggressively than others?
So, also glad that this was brought up because this is something else we're adding in our Decrim Resolution. So, we are adding a resolve that would effectively prevent any city department, including the police department, from using any city funding for the arrest, incarceration, anything involving controlled substances. And so, idealistically, we would also have a reallocation resolve in there. On a city level, that's a little more difficult to do, but reallocating those funds into things like free anonymous community drug testing services, which is going to help combat, an unregulated market. So yeah, when using language to specifically bar city departments like the police from using funding to incarcerate people for all controlled substances, that is the best way to combat that with a decrim all resolution, in my opinion.
Okay. Our next question is from Jason. For the pro-legalization team, doesn't a regulated market open more of our plants and natural environment up to capitalist exploitation? What is to protect the drug markets from the same fate of every other market that in that control ultimately ends up in the hands of super wealthy?
Most definitely. So, in terms of the first question, that's something that I've been grappling with as preparing for this debate. How can we make sure that plants and natural environment aren't exploited? And that is a very important aspect of it. And the only answer that I can ever come up with, personally researching, is to refer back to the Decrim nature model to talk about like the gift, gather, grow, to make it so then you can grow yourself. But then even then, it doesn't outweigh the ability of large capitalistic organizations. And that's why a big part of my point of view was that I think there should be some form of socialized market of production as to, one, make sure that the profit incentive that is inherent in every capitalist system doesn't get pushed onto the workers or the consumers, right? So no one's being economically exploited in this. But then two, since that would be a very heavily regulated industry if it was a socialized industry, especially considering talking in a USA framework, like in the US's framework of the conceptions of socialized industries, like thinking of like the USPS and such, it would be heavily regulated, hopefully to make sure that plants and natural environment wouldn't be exploited. But yet again, that is up to the discretion of whatever like governmental overseer there is, or whatever that would be. Yet again, this is still far out in the future. So it's something to be mindful of, something to consider, something to think about when formatting this kind of legislation. But then also when what is to protect the drug markets from the same fate of every other market. That's why I really wanted to hit hard on the fact that it has to be a socialized market. It can't be something that is purely capitalistic, because what we see is just big tobacco, but for literally every other substance. And that would be terrifying, and that would be horrible. And I think a socialized market or even a nationalized market would help to prevent this, because what often happens is the exploitation for psychoactive substances is based in this profit incentive, as we've seen before in every industry. And so if we eliminate the profit incentive, then we can eliminate that concern for exploitation of consumers and the drug market being overtaken by the super wealthy.
So our last question is also from Jason. For the Decrim only team, doesn't an unregulated market deny access to senior citizens who may not have access to street networks or the ability to find an unlicensed source of medicine? Ooh, that's a good one.
Wow. Okay, yeah, that's a really good one. Let me think about this for a sec. Yeah, so honestly, I don't really. I think it's kind of funny because, like, as young people, we're always really focusing on the youth perspective when we're talking about drug policy, and so to that end, I don't really think a lot about older folks' drug policy. So that is I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess, like, the only thing I can think of in terms of how to provide access is, like, young people educating older folks on how to have access to these medicines and these substances. And I saw something the other day that was saying, if you don't have a kid, or if you have kids and they don't teach you how to use your phone, then what's the point of having kids? That was obviously, yeah. But it's, like, I think that there is due diligence on our part as young people when pushing for these policies to also educate the older generations as well, which can be difficult. It's hard to make our voices heard a lot of the times, but the youth perspective is so important. And it really, at least in Michigan recently, the youth perspective has actually carried more weight in city council meetings than, older middle-aged folks. So that's a really good question. I don't have a solid answer, but that's what I've got right now. Something definitely to think about. Jules, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, it's just mainly about educating senior citizens on how to get access to these medicines. I know in Santa Cruz, we're more of a hippie town, so that is so much of an issue. I work at a dispensary, and I get people who come in and they'll see the dispensary prices and say, oh, like senior citizens who come in and see the dispensary prices and say, oh, I'm just going to go back to my old dealer. But we're a hippie town. So maybe just promoting that culture in other cities would be my solution. But yeah, I think legalization would definitely help a bit under this instance.
Can I add to the question? For example, I was thinking, I'm not saying that all old people cannot walk or cannot get out of the house, or I'm not trying to say that, but some, for some reason, for example, they cannot ride a car anymore, or they don't have anyone to get access to drugs, not only by education, but physically they cannot. So do you guys have any idea how to help them, not only educational, but like physically go out and get those drugs for them?
That's a really great point. So my answer to that would be on Nic's point, actually. So in support of Nic's point, because what just came to my mind was like Doordash for drugs, to give access to these medicines and substances for older people. Obviously, we can't really do that. I will say there are loopholes. So in Michigan, there are delivery dispensaries that are not actually registered. There's loopholes. They're able to operate even though they're not actually like regulated. Well, yeah, they are kind of. They're weird little loophole things. So stuff like that could be a potential possibility. It's risky as hell. So, but yeah, I guess that's a really great question, Ju. And if anyone else wants to add to that, please.
I think that when talking about, as I was saying, the socialized market, a good example would be talking about the post office, right? A lot of these private mail delivery companies don't want to send out mail to places that aren't profitable, where they actually lose money if they send it out to someone way out in the middle of nowhere. So they outsource that mail to the nationalized, like our mailing system, the United States Postal Service. And so that's what I've been trying to get at when talking about a lot of questions about like how would you compete with an illicit market, all of these other concerns, is that in this system, right, as we've seen with other similar nationalized or socialized systems, they don't have the incentive for profit. They aren't doing what they do based on profit. They can set the price at the bare minimum, and they can lose money with what they're doing because that's not what their focus is. Their focus is on the what their responsibility at hand is, and that's to provide safe access to substances. In a capitalist system, they wouldn't do that. They would just do what's profitable.
Right. Perfect. And we hit the time right on. I just want to thank everyone for being a part of this and preparing for this as well. I love the anti-capitalist talks here, and well, I'm super happy we had to have this conversation with not only the Zoom boxes, but everyone in the crowdcast right now. So this concludes our discussion. Please make sure to fill out the Google form survey that I've posted on the chat. I'll post it in a second right now too. But yeah, thank you everyone, and peace.
Thank you everyone so much.